do is to contrast some of the things that I have thought about in cultural studies with some traditional ideas of cultural studies and culture. Then maybe we can explore what that means in a place like this, because it's already, as you say, maybe 5 steps ahead. It has cultural production as the core, and so the problem is the reflection and the criticism of that production. I started the Center for Cultural Studies at CUNY Graduate Center in 1987. And what I have to say is that we have evolved, and we're constantly evolving as to what we do. We began at the very beginning. We began with basically 2 activities. One is we had an ongoing seminar with students and faculty about what is cultural studies. And I must say that the overwhelming majority of the people in the seminar were the people who are still the core of cultural studies around the United States, and that is people from English departments. And needless to say, they brought cultural studies approaches back to English and did not stay with the center. It was probably my fault, but I don't think it was entirely our fault. I think it was also the way they saw it. They wanted to learn things so they can go back and make English a better discipline, which I think is a worthwhile activity. However, much it differs from my own perspective. So that today at the graduate school, if you're in English or you're in comp lit as a student, or you're not so much history, but English and comp lit, anthropology and art history, you can't avoid coming in contact with courses within the disciplines that could be, in the more traditional sense, cultural studies courses. We have had enormous influence in the graduate school simply by our existence on the disciplines. Needless to say, many of those students still attend courses that I give and that other people in the core faculty of cultural studies give. We are still obliged to give them within the disciplines that we have been recruited. But our courses are quite different and are not duplicated, and I'll tell you why. This is what I want to talk about today. So we started as courses and a seminar, and we began to offer courses in cultural studies, and we cross-listed with other people. We began to encourage people around the graduate school, which has got 4,000 students, by the way, and most of the disciplines, traditional disciplines, in fact, almost all of them. And we would hold an annual conference on cultural studies at the beginning, 1989, 1991. Then something very interesting happened, and I'm just giving you a little history to begin with, which is that our graduate students started to have ideas. Now, that is itself a serious problem for faculty people. They don't like the students. I'm speaking factually here. I mean, dispassionately, and I'm not trying to be ironic. They're not particularly comfortable with graduate students having ideas. And my attitude as director was, go organize a conference around your ideas. Go organize, try to encourage an activity around your ideas. They had 2 kinds of ideas. One was ideas that led to study groups. And we have had, since about 1990, ongoing study groups. I'll tell you some of the topics in a minute. And 2, they began to become the core of the organization of conferences. And the thing about the conferences, and I promise you this is with some variation, pretty much the case. The conferences students organized would never have been conceived by faculty people within disciplines who were dedicated to their disciplines. They couldn't think about it. Not that they couldn't think about it intellectually, they couldn't think about it in a practical sense. But what we did provide for both students in the study groups and in these conferences was unthinkable, things that within disciplines. Now, I'm warning you about this because I expect that if you have a successful cultural studies program, people in various disciplines will take back some of the ideas and fold them into the disciplinary frameworks within which they are very comfortable and which they have been trained. I mean, after all, you know, most of us, and I'm not speaking about you, but most of us in academia, we do most of our learning as graduate students. And whatever we learn at the end, we spend the rest of our lives reproducing. Those of us who are different, some of us who are different, basically become freaks, marginals. You know, you get a phrase like this from Paul Buell. I mean, it's and Paul's an old friend of mine, you know, but he's mystified. He's totally mystified. You know? And you can't. I'm trying to get my name. I'm trying not to stand up too much. I have muscle spasm in my legs. Stanley Aronowitz is larger-than-life character, who was often, over decades of vigorous and varied speaking, writing, and organizing, seemed to be just out of his era. Well, I've been out of my era all my life. I'm always out of the era. I'm not in the era. I'm out of the era. Now, that's what cultural studies is really supposed to have been. But, as I said to you before, people have taken over this country. They've taken cultural studies, notwithstanding its origins, and they folded it back into, to a large extent, the literatures. English, complement, the language literatures, French, Spanish. And they've used the cultural studies approach to invigorate, reinvigorate their own disciplines, and I have no objection to that. I think that's good. But there is a project of cultural studies which is outside of that framework. And that project I'm going to describe now. Just to give you an example, when the students began to take over this whole conversation about cultural studies at the Graduate School of City University, the first thing that they got interested in almost was to examine popular culture. Now that is as traditional cultural studies as you can get, but they were examining popular culture in a different way. In 1991, we started something called the Cameo Project. The Cameo Project, which was a couple of faculty people, but largely students, community, activism, something, I forget what it was. And we picked up 75 grand from the Rockefeller Foundation to do the Cameo Project. Cameo Project had the following focus. It wanted to go into the communities of the city of New York to discover forms of cultural production, and then to document those forms of cultural production with video camera. So Augustine Lau and Rivera and some others, they went into Williamsburg and they went into East Harlem, Lower East Side, and other places, and they began to document cultural production. And then they put on an exhibit at the New Museum of the community-based cultural production, some of which were what are coded as graffiti, some of which were memoria of people who have died in places like Williamsburg, for example, that were put on walls of old buildings, and some of them were installations. And we did this museum exhibit at the New Museum, 1993, I guess. But what it was about was and then we did a lot of video interviews. We videoed a lot of interviews with people who had been in the memoria, the M was memory, and then something, organization, and I forget what the E was. We went to Puerto Rico, and we interviewed Gilberto Herrera Valentin, who had been a city councilman in the Bronx, a housing activist named Ernesto Martinez, with whom I had organized on the Lower East Side, both of them very retired people, you know, in their 70s and 80s, who reminisced about the whole history. And one of the things we learned about Puerto Rican history in the United States is that when Ernesto came to the United States, Ernesto came in 29 and Cadena came in 34, they were hyphenated Americans. They were considered Puerto Rican Americans. They had a national identity, but they never experienced themselves in the same way as blacks, for example, or as a minority. Now that wasn't necessarily true, but their experience was they could get a job in the shipyard, they could get certain kinds of jobs in the city. And to put it more bluntly, they were considered white. And then what happens in 1950, as the interview goes on, is that in 1950 with the Puerto Rican migration and the breakdown of the political left in New York City, both because of McCarthyism and a whole variety of other reasons, Puerto Rican-ness took on a whole different significance. And you know what 1950 is. 1950 is the day of the Nationalist Party and the repression of the Nationalist Party. But it's also the day when the big migration comes to the city of New York. And Ernesto, who had been a senior and a trade union activist, and Havana, who had been a trade union activist, became Puerto Rican leaders. A Puerto Rican community organizations in the Lower East Side and East Harlem. And what we learned from that experience, which was shown, was that identity is not an essence. It's historically situated and historically, changes. And that the communities that we went into had actually dedicated themselves to a certain extent to that memory, to the memory of their changes and to their hardships and to their difficulties and so on. Anyway, that was our first public activity. Notice one thing, we didn't have any texts except the texts of the artwork that was being done in the community and the text of the video that had been done. But it was cultural production about Latino culture as it emerged in the city of New York, both historically and as it presents itself in the community center. Another group of students, about 1993, 1992, I have to say one thing. One of the study groups that established itself in 1987 as we were establishing the center, decided to do a study group in science and technology. I was in that study group, and my book, Science is Power, comes out of that study group by acknowledging the acknowledgments. Those people in that study group, faculty and students who were in that, we studied the philosophy and history of science. We studied all the debates about technology. We read texts. And that group that began in 87, although the personnel has changed, we have had discontinuous only relatively speaking, but over the last 10 years, there's always been a study group on technology and science in the Center for Cultural Studies, which has been based. And some of them read the same text over and over again. And in the 90s, those study groups evolved. Some of them stayed with Center Technology. And we did do a technology conference. And some of those people began to get interested because they got interested in science and technology as objects in philosophy. So we now have, I'm just bringing you up to date, we now have a study group in the pre-Socratics. Well, because they have to know about technology. You can't know about technology unless you know the pre-Socratics and how they look upon the world and the relationship to the world. We have had a study group about Hegel. We've had a study group about Kant, Heidegger, whose question concerning technology is the major text for people to study. We've had a study group now about the news. Some of it is fashionable, some of it not. But basically, the students have, and you can't study, you must know this, you can't study philosophy in the United States. You really can't. Nobody reads Hegel. I mean, I know one guy, his name is Pippin, he's in Chicago. In the major school, yeah, Bob Pittman, yeah. You can't read in major graduate programs philosophy. What you can read is analytic philosophy and Wittgenstein and Quine and so on and so on. And I have no objection to that. But you can't read anything which is called European or continental philosophy, much less, let alone Eastern philosophy. You can't, none of that's available. So we were being pressured partially because my classes do this. You have to read my classes, right? All this stuff. because, you know, I'm a sociologist, and the basis of sociology is philosophy. It's the fight between Kant and Hegel. And how can you know sociology unless you learn Kant and Hegel? Marx and all that. So they've done that. Now, I want to get to another point, though. You see, as they began to study technology and science and philosophy and stuff, they began to branch out in their conception of what kind of conferences they wanted to do. So one group now, on October 16th, will do a conference under the aegis of the Center for Cultural Studies and a couple of other centers, including the Women's Studies Center, called Women in Development. And they'll be at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and Gayatri Spivak is going to be a main speaker, and other people will be main speakers, and they raise a huge amount of money around this conference. Students raise money solely. That's what they raised a lot of money. I mean, $100,000, something like that, or something. You know, me too, Hirschman. Almost single-handedly. It's an amazing thing. And in the spring, we're doing a conference on dwelling, on urbanism. And we're going to have 300-400 people there of all kinds. Probably Chet Hartman will come, and Peter Marcuse, you know, people who have something to offer. Squatters, people from squatters movements in San Jose, people from squatters movements in New York, and people who are interested in this whole problem of urbanism and dwelling and housing and all that. And it's under the influence of, that's entirely student organized. I come in just to help them, help them get rooms and, you know, small things like that. But basically they do virtually all the planning. The Women in Development House has considerable faculty participation. But what is this all about? What has this got to do with cultural studies? The second part of what I wanted to say today is that we do not define culture as an object. It's not as if there's an object called culture that can be subjected to study from different disciplinary perspectives. We see, and this is almost philosophical, and it's in my book, by the way, Role of Beethoven. I laid this out very clearly. We see culture, or whatever, cultural production, cultural discourse, as infusing science, technology, political economy, urbanism, literature, popular culture, and everything. The implication being, and I know it's going to sound funny to you and it's going to sound ridiculous to you, but I'm going to say it as plainly as I can, that what we try to do here, this is the pedagogy of this project of the Cultural Studies Center, is that students have to be intellectuals and not specialists. That they really have to have a larger framework for not that they shouldn't have a trade so they can go and make a living. I'm not opposed to that. I have a trade, I can make a living. I really can't tell you about sociology if I need to. Oh, it's true. I mean, I can. And I teach contemporary sociological theory, the required course, and I teach it, so that people can have that kind of background. But that in effect, what culture is about for our students as a pedagogical question is fundamentally to find the ways, what Raymond Williams says, as convenient as I can make it, a whole way of life in both cultural products as well as in things that are not traditionally defined as cultural products, such as urbanism, such as science. So that when we study science, we're not simply studying what Kuhn studies in science, although we do that too, or what Popper studies in science. We're trying to understand how processes of scientific production have to do with the production of the knowledge that is now taken as truth. So people do ethnographic work in the sciences if they can. They go into laboratories, or they think about how to go into laboratories. So people study the in the jobless future, we went to the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. We went to engineering workplaces to study the influence of CAD on the transformation of the engineering workplace. And students do that. But what happens is the transformation is not simply a transformation in how people do their work in the narrow sense, but it's a transformation of culture. If you're now looking at a machine, rather than making 20 drawings for every, switch in the Department of Transportation or the Transit Authority, it's a very different process. It's a very different way of cultural production than in the old system. So while there's reflection, we have shifted our emphasis from the texts of popular culture, not to say that people don't still do that, to cultural production as a text. And we've shifted our emphasis from the humanities, or humanities-oriented kind of thing, to understanding this concept of the whole way of life, which includes class and gender and ethnic and all kinds of other things. Now, what happened as a result of this is that long process, I'll answer questions if you want. We, together with some other groups, are now thinking about a PhD program in intercultural studies. Okay. Well,
the new school had a shot at it some years ago with a master's program, right? But it's very much lacking in the city.
Yeah. There's nothing in the city. And needless to say, our disciplinary colleagues in the graduate school are fighting this tooth and nail, partially because they're afraid that we will take the students. It's all foolish in a certain way. I mean, they don't want resources to be distributed. They don't want any power to be distributed. But there is enough momentum now that we're going to make a big fight of it, and we've got a proposal, and we've got various things. We're also convinced that unless there are PhD programs in this field, what happens in this area, what happens is that everybody gets reabsorbed into the disciplines, and what we're trying to do gets lost. What we're trying to do is very different than what people who will study Madonna or people who will study Walt Disney as a narrow discourse. We have people who study Walt Disney, of course, and want to study Walt Disney. But they will study it in relation to a whole, to whole social and historical environment. It's very different. At the beginning, we used to teach semiotics a lot. We used to teach discourse analysis. We still do that, but I do that in a very different context. The context, of course, is you got to go to classes at the end. See, that's something that we also teach about. When you have a good conversation or a bad conversation going, then what happens is you're regimented into classes. I see you have all that. Thank you very much. What? Oh, I know. Anyway, so with the PhD program and the conferences and the going into the community and doing ethnography, we have a program that does not resemble this. Now, let me tell you about our history. Every time I give a course, what was the course I gave? What was it called, Stephanie? The visual course.
The perception one? I don't remember the name of it.
Social theory of the visual. Okay. 8 art history students came in of 2020. And I said, don't they offer anything like this, a social theory of the visual? It prima facie, right? You would study the philosophy and technology and the social theory of the visual. Because what is art history about if not the visual? You would do a meta-theoretical discourse about the visual, and study Mitchell and Martin Jay and much older people like Panofsky and all that, And they said, no, there's nothing given like this. They study things like 17th century, 18th century, English, French, German.
Even at CUNY, I thought that we were.
Well, when Roz and Linda Nochlin, Rosalind Krauss left, even the possibility of that was.
I mean, that part, so I can tell you a little bit about it. It wasn't a big battle.
I know.
It's now been, well, from our point of view, I guess, lost.
Lost, yeah.
The crowd's left and not left. And it's now it's going even more in the direction of looking at objects and time periods, less and less of that.
I mean, Carol Armstrong holds aloft the banner, but it's a thin reed upon which to build the department. So instantly I became an art history department. It's really true. Now, they started giving me papers, calling me at home, would I help them, would I be on their committee? No, I can't. I have 17 PhD students, and I'm on secondary reader on, another 10. So I can't. So I said, you've got to pressure your department to do a little different kind of hiring. Now, students are not in a very good position often to do that. But the problem is that we're fighting a lot of battles. And one of the battles is how do you accommodate with relatively few faculty, because one of the problems, as you know, we have an affiliate, we have a consortium agreement. I'm on the central line faculty, which means that I teach full time, and now that they made me a distinguished professor, it's one course a semester, No, it's a big problem, and very few other faculty can spare the time from their colleges like Queens or Brooklyn or Staten Island stuff to do this kind of teaching. So we have to hire new people, and that's a very difficult thing, because when you get as you very well know, and it's not present company, I hope, excluded, people tend to hire themselves. You know what I mean? They don't hire strange people that they don't understand and their work is difficult, and so it's a problem. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to stop for questions and comments. We continually struggle. Friday we had a meeting of the Intercultural Committee. We had 20 people there, almost all faculty, 3 students. We continually struggle with the problem, or to put it more scientifically, the problematic of how do you transcend the category of culture as an object or cultural objects, and at the same time not get so diffuse that the cultural becomes mushy, I don't think that's a soluble problem. I don't think it's a problem of definition. I don't think it's a problem of the more precise boundary, taking boundary limitations. What I think it's about is, in a sense, helping faculty to distance themselves, if not free themselves, to provisionally adopt another view that allows them to change their practice. So that the term we're now using, rather than interdisciplinary, which, by the way, assumes the integrity of the disciplines, which we do not, is trans or non-disciplinary. We're not talking about a discipline which delimits the object of knowledge in ways that are more or less conventional according to the German university system of 1840, which is what the American system is. We're trying as hard as hell to encourage people so that, for example, Patricia Clough is teaching courses about the body and is teaching courses about television. She's trying to teach and when she teaches about television, she's trying to deal with issues of cultural production, not just cultural reception, even though she can't operate a camera. I mean, but at least to see that dimension and be able to understand it. And that's the hardest thing, because what we're talking about is ingrained habits of people like us who are a little bit older and who have a hard time breaking, from old habits. So it's in a sense an ongoing seminar, an ongoing. The planning process for the PhD has been a 4-year process of continually breaking down disciplinary barriers. Just one other thing I want to stop. And identity barriers, because we have had the gay and lesbian studies, the women's studies, the cultural studies, the African American studies, which is called BRADAC, it's the African diaspora studies, and the Latino studies. We've had 5 groups and 1 half group, which is the Asian group, the first one. And they come in and they say, well, we're into our identity. This is a coalition. And gradually, it's not going to, the coalition concept has broken down. Because now people see themselves in a very different construct. Not that they give up, identity politics or identity intellectual work, but they see the program that we're trying to develop as something that's outside of what they might do if they were a Latino studies program and simply streaming it together to be a PhD. They see that they have to participate in these problems of development of diaspora studies. They have to understand, and we, by the way, define the program as a diaspora program. That is to say, we say that the problem of cultural studies, as Bill Roy says, the problem of cultural studies is to address cultural formation in the context of the fact that this is a nation of diasporic peoples. And that whether it be in literature, or whether it be in urban stuff, or whether it be in popular television or movies or whatever, that question of the border between national identities and between international global context and the sub-identities or the identities that are built up around that is one of our major concerns. So this guy who's operating this camera, one of his major, in his dissertation, one of his major things, which is on film, by the way, is to take touch of evil as a border question, in part. And secondly, how is space produced in the film? How is space produced? Because the film is not simply telling a narrative, it is producing space. So we're working in a liminal kind of space, and that's a very difficult thing to do. And let me say this, that the amount of time it takes to write an average dissertation proposal under those circumstances is 3 times the amount that it would take if you wrote, some literature, 17th century art objects or whatever the hell it is. And that takes a faculty that's very different than the one we have. It takes a long time for that faculty to emerge. It has to be a learning community as well as a planning community. Anyway, that's all.
You're a center right now, but you're not fearful of becoming like the other departments at CUNY to become a department?
Terrified. That's why I'm saying, well, what we do about it is we do what we're doing, which is using every one of our planning meetings in the intercultural studies to move people along a little bit. I don't mean to say towards me or my position, but to together figure out how we can avoid some of that. For example, we're going to have a core curriculum, and one of them is on the production of knowledge. How's knowledge? One of them is on political economy, have that political economy. But it's not just going to be political economy, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, etc. It's going to be the political economy, that theoretical perspective in the light of the global system. Who's going to teach that? I think we've got a lot of people who can teach that stuff. We're going to have to teach ourselves. So maybe one of the things is an ongoing faculty development seminar that's going to help us not become what the other departments become.
Well, the CUNY Art Department approach that it's sort of being open to new ways of thinking about it. Our program is not a full program. You don't get an artist's degree, a modern artist's degree. That's a huge problem for certain people in the program, and that's what they're trying. That's the kind of group that will change the program, because somehow we might have a certain status as a full degree. So what I'm saying is that even with the best of intentions, it's so hard to keep open like that. I mean, we lost 2 faculty, and all of a sudden it's completely different.
Well, that's all. I mean, you don't need to lose very many if you have some 1 or 2 people who are the driving forces of a particular department. It could, change the character of the department. I mean, one of the problems. I mean, I have to say this. It's Sisyphus who are pushing uphill, and the reason we're pushing uphill is because as long as the job is the final product of what you're doing, you're always in trouble because you're being shaped, you're being configured by disciplinary requirements. Like you said, modern art history, that's not a full degree. And the sociology or the comp lit or any of these places, the best you could hope for is individuals. But you know what's funny? Individuals who come out differently. What's very funny, you wouldn't believe, you wouldn't think so. But the students that I've worked with, my experience, 15 years, not small, in that place, who have done these strange and wonderful and marginal things, land on their feet. Right? That's one example.
I'm on my class.
Some others don't.
We have all kinds of sparks of this kind of thing. Professor Randy Martin with the incomparable science. But last year we had, just as you were talking about how the film shows how space is being made in the film, we showed a film, a number of departments can have architecture, video people, artists, painters, for a film with the Cohen Brothers of Barcelona. And a lot of us thought, well, it would be a kind of ethno-history thing about how the slums were torn down for the Barcelona World's Fair. And what emerged in this film is like a painting. It keeps evolving. It's like, it's the strangest thing in the world. There are people still talking about it. A year later, it was a spark. I think you mentioned that the school has these sparks and things happen. And this was the students basically doing this, bringing these films, which we now have in the presentation. It was amazing to see, not interdisciplinary at all. There were people from video show, there were painters, and it was something no one had really seen here. And yet this is a place where people produce film and architecture and ethno history, planning, and all of the stuff, but it was something strange. It might be called interdisciplinary.
It was producing something new
Totally.
that could not be produced in any departmental context, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to produce something new. But people are terrified of that. I mean, at the graduate school, I don't mean to say students are terrified, but faculty is terrified that you're going to produce something new and political territory is going to be redistributed thereby.
Is that produce or describe?
What?
Do you produce space or do you describe space?
Produce space. You produce space. I mean, there are
I always heard it as describes space.
no, I don't think it's a description. I don't think it's
Because space.
but a description is a epistemological category, and production is an ontohistorical category. It's about being produced in historical context. I just have to refer you to Zatz over there. I mean, he's done, but he's taught me. It's not, I don't teach him much, or Brown, I don't know. But anyway, the production of space that takes place in a film, for example, or for that matter in a novel, or for that matter in a union organizing drive, is that for the first time, something can be seen, if you want to use the word seen, through reflection, something can be seen in a totally different light, and relationships are reconfigured. And to give you an example from Touch of Evil, if you read the classical, and I did, because he was doing this work, it's one of the great advantages of being a graduate student, as they do new work, you can read stuff too. The classical treatments, the standard treatments minutes of this classical film, Touch of Evil, authored by Boston Wells, describes, or let me put it this way, the space that is described is determined by the times within which that criticism is being written. In other words, they don't see the same border that Ivan Zat sees. His description is made possible by the times within which he lives, but what he shows is how space is produced in the film. They don't show how space is produced in the film. They treat this as entirely a narrative problem. In other words, most of the classical criticism of Touch of Evil is a narrative criticism. And he's showing narrative production. He's showing spatial production. And in the spatial production, there's a political dimension, which is what is happening to the relationship between the United States. In that film, you can see the evolving relationship between the United States and Mexico. You can see the beginning of the drug war. You can see the beginning of a whole new kind of subordination in Mexico to the United States. All of that is done in and through the production of space. And if you want to know how it works, so I think I'll let him show you some of this stuff.
I really find this interesting because I came here with someone whose orientation is, say, more libertarian in the left and more Jungian and Campbellian and Freudian. And so, with an interest in how cultural studies pretty much, in this perspective, suppose this Frankfurt School point of view. And I'm struck much more by your description of Frankfurt School. Well, a lot of cultural studies comes from the kind of Freudian Marx point of view, looking at culture and they're, one is in that circle, one thinks that's how we look at culture. If you're not in that circle, that's one way to look at culture.
That's right.
But I'm much more struck by this problem of interdisciplinarianism. When I graduated architecture school about 65, highly influenced by, say, Campbell's, Wenger, McLuhan, all of those empowering interdisciplinary accomplishments. And to 30 years later, seeing we haven't gotten anywhere. I think that this struggle to allow our students and allow our disciplines to have this point of view is still, it's still a struggle. And I'm wondering if perhaps just be looking more outside of academia, that people can sit in a corner somewhere and write a book and look at culture from a particular point of view, totally independent of any departmental politics, as a non-university. And maybe that's where these interdisciplinary achievements take place.
I don't think that's a bad perspective. I would suspect that there are people who are doing that. One of the things that I did in the book Roll Over Beethoven is that I actually traced cultural studies not only to the Birmingham School, which is Stuart Hall and Company, which is that Marxist perspective that you had, but to Gilbert Selby's, through Tom Wolfe, through journalism. And if we look at who was breaking the barriers between literature and so-called literature and popular culture, who was talking initially about films as proper objects for study, who was talking about Crazy Cat? It's Gilbert Selby, huh? Well, exactly. And then the next one is Tom Wolfe, a major figure. And I talk about the Popular Front as the Communist Popular Front as one attempt.
And they do it totally outside of academia.
Absolutely, that's the whole point. And it gets into academia, cultural studies, around 1964 in Britain, and comes to the United States in the mid-70s, and immediately gets reabsorbed. Now, I'm not claiming that this is the way to go for all of cultural studies, but I'm claiming, and as a matter of fact, my partner, Ellen Willis, runs a cultural reporting and criticism program at NYU in the journalism school, in which the other the text is Tom Wolfe, Electric Kool-Aid acid test, and so on and so on and so on. Not any of these other people. You know, so look, just a second. So the point is, it's both places. Why do you do it here? Because that's where we are. You know, why do I do my union activity in CUNY? Because we have a union which smells, and we have to fight to make it better. I'd like to do it with, I do it with auto workers on a whole different basis, but I'd like to do it in someplace else, but I happen to be here.
Now, do you feel you're able to say to your students, break the rules, do an interdisciplinary thesis, and you still have a good chance of getting a job?
I say it, and as long as it's true, it's true. It is true.
Because I
I
know
say
it's
that's the
true.
funny part of it.
It was true for me, but when I say it to my young colleagues, or teaching colleagues who are still working on their PhDs, they say, oh, no, you can't do that anymore. It's, you know, it's so more difficult out there.
Look, the one thing that I tell all the students that we work with, by doing this kind of work, you are condemning yourself to marginality in the university. But that doesn't mean you won't get a job. It means the job that you're going to get is not going to be in one of the big research universities. Now, you may not want a job in one of the big research universities. The only good thing about a job at a research university is that teaching loads are a little less, and you can work with graduate students, you can work with PhD students. But apart from that, there's a lot of small colleges like Pratt and state schools that welcome people who have new ideas, who are fresh, who are different. However, having said that, it's also true, and I'll say this, you know, because I know who the present company is and it doesn't apply to them, that unless you're twice as good or 3 times as good, it's like being black, or when you used to have to be a Jewish doctor, you had to be 3 times as good as a Jewish doctor. In this field, you have to be 3 times as good as anybody that comes out of Harvard. And by the way, they're 3 times as good. You could get away with being 4th class with a degree from Harvard or Yale in a way that you can't get away with being 4th class with a degree from CUNY. But when you're 3 times as good, you edge them out.
Gentlemen don't go to CCNY.
Exactly. And so you have the old figures of people like Danny Bell, who was, you know, a lead, I think he's odious, but he was a leading social theorist of his period. He went to CCNY. He had to be 3 times as good as any H. Stupid Hughes, who came out of Harvard. He was, he was an intellectual historian, H. Stupid Hughes, actually. But Hughes didn't have to be as good as Bell. Bell had to be better. So the same thing is true of people who come out of where we are. That's no more than
How do you treat Montfort?
Oh, I love Lewis Montfort. I have not used Techniques in Civilization. I put it on reading lists and stuff. Lewis Montfort is the equivalent of Tom Wolfe and Gilbert Selby's in both urban, I don't have to tell you, you know this, urbanism, architecture, the whole critique of technology. He anticipates the Frankfurt School critique in Heidegger by 20 years. I mean, that goes without saying. The thing that I think is very interesting about Lewis Montfort, that he was not in the academy, was a benefit to him because you could not be, as McLuhan was in Canada in the 1940s and 1950s, in the 1920s and 30s, you could not be in the academy and have his critique of technology. And his critique in 1934 was just, you know, mind-blowing. He was connected to literary criticism. He edited The American Caravan with Alfred Kremberg and with, you know, people like that. He was connected to political movements. He was a very engaged and broadly based figure, which is profoundly anti-academic in the current situation. But
did he suffer all by not being in that?
What he
didn't
suffered?
have students,
Huh?
and he didn't really have students, followers.
He had followers.
Carried on.
No, I think what he suffered, I think he wrote books. I think he was a social critic. I think he was a journalist. I think, like Tom Wolfe, well, Tom Wolfe had a PhD in American Studies at Yale, actually. But like Wolfe and others, he was atheoretical. He was not a-philosophical, but he was a-theoretical. And unless you're theoretical in academic precincts, you can't have ongoing influence. Because the influence is grounded in your ideas that can be reduced to 25 words or less. I mean, when McLuhan coins phrases, you know, those pithy phrases, the global village, he is doing something which is necessary within these institutions, which is to give people a framework from which further research can emanate. Mumford and Wolff felt no obligation to do that. And that may be their strength, but at the same time it makes them marginal academic. Every context has its rules. And he broke those rules because he was outside, and probably it was a good thing too. Yeah.
I'd like to move into a different direction. For those of us older than you, came out of a Western background, okay, who want to say, straight markers in terms of understanding history, and you see, we take Hobsbawm as an example.
Eric Hobsbawm.
Yeah, that's a person who I think is a phenomenal understanding of the forces that shape world history in the 20th century.
And he's shown it with the book.
Right.
Wonderful book.
Okay, the age of extremes in particular, and that has a lot of culture in it.
Right.
But yet he's unsympathetic in large measure, right, to the current trends that he sees as anti-intellectual in terms of not focusing on the big issues. My own question, having been inculcated in that type of stream of thinking, what are the principal ideas of cultural history that can, through a greater insight, enlarge the type of analysis that a person like Hobsbawm gives to the history?
Hobsbawm is fighting turf wars. If you read, I mean, I know his work intimately, and if you read Primitive Rebels and Bandits, these are what this is what the Birmingham School would call subcultural studies. You know, you know what they are. I mean, Bandits and Primitive Rebels are about the millenarian movements, one in the Midway, which were essentially anti-modern. And what he does in those books is that he opens up the possibility that modernity is not taken for granted as presupposition of any possible historical struggle, because he's sympathetic to anti-modernist movements. Now, he's doing cultural studies because he's looking, in that particular case, he's looking at the margins to find the truth of an epoch, or at least a truth of the epoch. When he studies laboring men in the old days, you know, there was a certain kind of innovation there. What he doesn't like, though, you see, is that Eric, who I know, so I can call him Eric, Eric imagines himself an orthodox Marxist. And I was saying to Randy, because I'm writing a long, not even a review, I'm writing a long essay, the Marcuse Uncollected Papers of Marcuse, the ones that never had been printed, have just been published by Routledge, and Douglas Kellner has done it. And I was saying to Randy before, the one thing about Marcuse is that Marcuse, and you'll find this, some of you remarkable and some unremarkable, self-described orthodox Marxist. What Marcuse thought he was doing was extending Marxism to areas that Marx and the forebears had not covered, like culture, like technology and so on, however you may think that he did it. He thought he was doing Marxism. Now, of course, he forgot conveniently, I think, that he was also a Heidegger student, but he was. But the point is that is a self-conception that is belied by the actual work. And you know, as Marx himself said, you never ask somebody what they think and expect that that's what who they are. History takes place behind their backs. And so my answer to you is, Hobsbawm is a cultural studies person behind his own back.
I have a question about curriculum. So you say you have we're going to have we're going to have a core curriculum at CUNY for the cultural studies. Saying, of course, we just started talking about cultural studies here, and me here, and
is that we have decided, and this has been a result of 4 years of discussion, that common ground is necessary. Both a common language, common texts, common understanding, and so on. At the point at which that common, and as I don't want to say as I've said, but as you know I've said more than once, you read Plato, but you don't read it with reverence. You read Plato or any other text critically, and you distance yourself from the text to see what's going on in it, enough to go see what's going on in the text, and that includes Marx or Heidegger or anybody else that you read. So that the canon is only a starting point. It's not the ground from which everything else emanates. Unavoidable, absolutely. And I wouldn't say that everybody who will teach such a core program is going to deconstruct the text, but we have to try to get them to do that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you have to try to get people to look at these somewhat critically. The more significant problem that I see is avoiding the lecture. You can't lecture. You've got to read, you've got to do close textual analysis. Now, many of our colleagues have never experienced close textual analysis in their lives. Now, I know that many of you have, but you can't have somebody teaching a course called Foundations of Knowledge, so it's Foundations of Knowledge, and lecture on the pre-Socratics or lecture on Plato's Symposium. You have to teach them how to go to the text and read the text in a class, how to organize the class into study groups so that students are really teaching themselves. I don't believe anybody teaches anybody. I really don't. But they're teaching themselves to surrender some of their authority, in effect, to the process. Now, that's pretty goddamn difficult, if not threatening, to a lot of people who relish having such a battle.
The question about process, if you have a reading group, you have the students read a text, that it's important, and then you have a discussion. How far off the text should you allow the discussion to go? I mean, how close should you keep bringing students back?
Close without being ridiculous, but really close reading means reading a paragraph and then saying, what did it think? And asking questions and Socratically posing issues.
I think we should learn the way the Bible is presented. One part of the time we was given now, also, especially with students in the art institute, you are not making a assignment and they don't read it. So the only security I have that we cover the same kind of ground is if I read the paragraph in class 1 paragraph at a time. And I will spend 1 hour on one paragraph. It's slow and they finish the article. And only one article that can be read in 2 hours. So I limit the reading so that we can spend, an hour and 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs.
That's the first step. The second step is to be able to do a discourse analysis rather than simply doing a narrative of the text and its meaning. A discourse analysis may highlight, and in translation it's extremely difficult, but you can try, is to highlight issues that are presented by the formulations. So that if not a semiotic analysis, in other words, reading signs, although I would strongly advocate that be done as well, at least understand the tendency of the discourse, to see what is really being aimed at by the writer in that particular situation. Now, I think there are texts, any text that does not lend itself to close reading is not worth doing in the foundation course. And what a good text is one that allows itself to be interrogated because it has a sufficient level of complexity for pedagogical purposes. And complexity is what we aim for, which that's why I like certain kinds of writings.
How far back do you go in describing where these ideas come from? I sometimes find that sort of it's an endless path.
Well, you have to, it's arbitrary. I mean, I would love to be able to make, but in this study group that meets on Friday afternoon now, which I attend, the question has been raised, it's a small group, 4 or 5 people. The question has been raised, weren't the Milesians and the Ionian philosophers, they're different, weren't they largely dependent upon Egyptian work? And how do you get the Egyptian work to do the tracing? No. And nobody in the class, including me, nobody in the study group, including me, really reads Arabic. But they did. So there was a problem of inference. I would suggest, however, that no one, it's a terrible thing to say, I know it's going to be misinterpreted, I can't help saying it, no one is genuinely educated who has not been in Kirk, who has not been in Pratt, and then gone on to Plato, and then gone on to Aristotle. So you can, but you can't do it all. So you have to, what I figure is going to happen in this course that we do Foundations of Knowledge is that we're going to have to actually make up a couple of books. We're going to have to make up books so that there are key things. And the best Plato translation, by the way, is not the Java translation; it's the Bloom translation. The famous one, Bloom. He's a wonderful Greek scholar, and to get that the Republic, to get some of that stuff done would be important. So I would go back to the pre-Socratics. Absolutely.
Now, there's a school in design, art and design, where they have one semester only. How much time you train students?
1 year.
In 1 year? You have 1 year? I'm asking in the school, how many course members can we? Let's assume that because you guys read one paragraph or not. There is so much background necessary. Can you give them the foundation? There is a visual arts foundation, but there is no cultural foundation, is there? Now, where you start straight into high school.
I would just,
an 18-year-old comes to school of architecture, one of the faculty do high school, out of it. How do you deal with that?
I mean, if you want to speak about that situation, Heidegger's not his best books, but his most important books after being in time is early Greek thinking in the front end.
So you go from there back.
Yeah, sure. And you gotta go back.
That's our curriculum allows that kind of looking back.
Well, I don't know about an undergraduate, and I'm not going to make a comment about that.
But those are our pages.
I understand, but I do think, at some point you have to decide how the conversation, how far back the conversation can go in the group to provide some kind of a framework for what goes ahead. I remember English people, at Irvine, I taught at Irvine for 5 years, and I remember English people reading Derrida, and I was saying, what'd you get out of Derrida? What do you? Oh, we read Derrida's critique of Hegel's Les Pyramides, and I said, oh, and you have read Hegel, and they say, no. And I said, even the part of Hegel that he refers to? No. And I said, there's something wrong with this. So Derrida was there, and I said to David Carroll and Suzanne Gerhardt, I said, Derrida's read Hegel. Oh, no, he has. He read this. And Derrida's read the Frankfurt School. Jacques Derrida has read Marx. No. So I said, Jacques, come over here, would you please? You've read Adorno. He says, bien sûr, of course. And his acolytes, who were professors, who were teaching Derrida, were shocked that he had read Adorno. But they hadn't read Hegel, as they studied. Unacceptable. To me, unacceptable.
Well, this raises I think a somewhat broader issue for us, in that we, on the undergraduate level, are art design school, and students have certain limitations. And there's been a tendency among faculty members over the past several years to follow the fashions that Derrida, Heidegger, et cetera, where, I got in school, Kevin Lynch, James Jacobs, Mumford, which I just think for the 18-year-old coming out of high school with an interest in the arts, which means not a strong literary background, that they are going to, starting with something much more mundane, will give them just the ability to read. Because I think we have a lot going on, I think, in this school and other schools that I observe, of faculty members who really don't understand what they're talking about, presenting these fashions to students who have the vaguest idea what it's about. And then everybody tries to pick up some jargonistic word and extend in their jury and talk about interiority instead of being solving, and figure that they've now accomplished something. And so I think that we have another problem here, which is to simply be able to present to our students classical, but I'll use the word mundane reading that they can handle, that gives them a grip on just the notion of engaging with ideas.
Nobody can, I may sound one note here, but I don't mean it that way. Nobody cannot understand early Greek philosophy. Nobody cannot understand Aristotle. He's not that difficult. Plato wrote the translations of Plato, the English translations, or the Bloom translations are limpid prose. The early Greeks are done, the pre-Socratics are done in easy terms. When you're talking about Kant's critique of pure reason, I did a faculty seminar in Irvine, they didn't know what the hell I was talking about. It was clear that they needed something else. And to start with Kant, they couldn't do it, and to start with Hegel. But the problem, it seems to me, is this. I'm writing a book on higher education, I have to tell you that. So. My own experience was that I was twice as able to learn at the age of 16, 17, 18, 19 as I am today. I'm so much dumber now than I was then. When I remember what I actually did read, I'm self-educated certainly, but what I was actually able to read at that age, it was remarkable. Then I went through a middle period where I couldn't read as well. So I took refuge in reading history. That's where I got all this. No, it's not. That's not it. You know what I'm saying? And because it was, and I came back to this. And wow. But it seems to me that one of the problems that we do have is that we don't have a required course in high school in philosophy. One of the most transformative reading experiences of my life, I mean this literally, was to read Simone Signoret's autobiography, where she describes, in several pages, being in a classroom with her high school philosophy teacher, Jean-Paul Sartre. It was wonderful. Clearly, this great actress had a broad literary and political understanding, and most of it came out of high school. So we have this problem. The problem we have is we got to do it in college.
But one of the things that's interesting...
I know it's a trade school. I don't mean that to be disrespectful.
But one of the interesting things that French education at that time was codified in the sense that there was a clear body of material that was really clear to the teachers who were teaching that they were presenting. What's going on now, at a lot of levels, is these splitting fashions of 1 year it's Foucault, and next year it's Aristotle, and next year it's Deleuze, and the teachers are presenting this stuff, and they have not prepared themselves the way Sartre was prepared to teach this to his high school students. And so it becomes these fashions of students thinking that they're intellectual because they can throw around big words.
I don't disagree with you. I think we need a systematic track.
I'm very much in favor of the canon, and I'm not too concerned what it is, because, so in second year, I know that every one of my students has had this last year, then I know, and I don't care, it's not the Iliad or the Odyssey, one or the other, tell me which it is, and then I can teach from that for what I'm going to do in the second year. But we don't, it's just always all over the place.
But if you have a program in cultural studies for a major in cultural studies, it seems to me that you said Hegelian Marx or Marxist, you have to go through at least that. You have to go through certain other kinds of things. I don't mean to say that that's the only thing. It is important to read Heidegger on the question concerning technology. It is important to read Mumford, maybe. It is important to read some key work of film theory, I would have my idea and somebody else would have their idea. But you have to have some common ground. But once you get that canon, which need not be what I'm suggesting pre-Socratics, I think that would be more general, is people can't just do it in 1 hour classes. They have to do it, you have 2.5 hour classes here. Three. You have to do the line by line. You have to do, and it has to be sometimes regardless of its relevance to cultural production that they're involved in, that graphic, computer graphics.
Well, apropos of this, how do you relate the development of this knowledge and this canon to practice? I think very much of Freire's approach to education is to use it and try to use it. It's very strongly linked to practice, and what we teach is very strongly linked to practice. So, how do you integrate that?
You might be interested to know Freire's last book, which is not out yet. It's called Pedagogy of Freedom. It's out!
I got it yesterday.
Oh my, and why didn't I get it?
I don't know. I got it from the company before it was printed.
There's an introduction by Stanley Aronowitz in that book. Oh my God. And
This is dessert.
oh boy. Anyway, I'm just saying that because, see, Freddie, I have another essay which I wrote based on, I did a reading, like I suggest people do, of pedagogy of the oppressed. I did a reading, my own reading. I did line by line reading, and I put notes and so on, and I wrote an essay called The Radical Democratic Humanism of Paulo Freire. And in the reading of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, guess what I discovered? It's nothing remarkable. Lenin said there are 3 component sources of Marxism, utopian socialism, English classical political economy, and German philosophy. Freire has 3 component sources. One is Freud via Erich Fromm, the other is Marx, and the third is Sartre, existentialism. And his intellectual orientation was the framework from which he operated. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means for Freire is that he was totally convinced that you had to have an intellectual framework, but that at the same time, you had to connect that intellectual framework to people's lives, to the conditions of peasants in northeastern Brazil, to the conditions of people in Chile, to the conditions of people in Guinea-Bissau. But dialogue for him did not mean that the 2 speakers were equal. That is, equal in background, equal in experience, but that the teacher had an obligation to treat the knowledge of the learner seriously and herself or himself be prepared to learn. That dialectical process was the dialogic process about which he spoke. All I'm suggesting is that what doesn't exist in most of our pedagogy is the framework from which a practice can be illuminated. Not that the practice is not addressed. The practice, however, is not the practice only of linking it to cultural production. That's, I think, a given. The practice is also the practice of being able to learn how to read. If we do anything else as teachers, it's helping students learn how to read. Not because they don't know how to do it. I don't care how smart they are, what their IQs are, how good they can do computer graphics or whatever the hell they're doing. They don't know how to read. Reading is really where it's at. I sat in this class today, literally for an hour, in which all of the questions that came to me, because they've been studying the so-called Aronowitz today, and what about matter, God, truth,
just the little questions.
and there were more questions than I could handle. They were going past and past. they're hungry, they want to learn this stuff. I gave them books to read, I gave them references about the, the background of the debate. They were into it. And it seems to me that if we take that seriously, if their own desires are taken as the basis, we will discover that people want to do things that are both connected to their ongoing vocational practice, and I don't mean that to mean vocational school, vocational in the religious sense, their vocational practice, but also in their thirst for intellectual development.
Well, on that note, we'll take a little pause for about 4 weeks. Pick this conversation up Monday, October